Is all this for that video you've been endlessly talking about?
Yeah, I'm working on a video about Indy's bag. It seemed pretty interesting, so I thought I'd do that.
I thought you said the video was about Indiana Jones action figures.
I am working on that.
What about Bionic 6 Part 2?
I am working on that.
What about the Terradrome restoration, the Defiant review, Batman the Animated Series, MacGyver Part 2, the Thundercats revisit, the next Star Wars Follies?
I'm working on those too.
I sense nothing but disorganization.
Sometimes creativity is not necessarily a linear path.
You should dispense with the lofty poetry and get back on schedule. Explain to me how you get anything done.
I don't know, I'm making it up as I go.
They're gonna fly it out of here. That Ark gets loaded, we're already gonna be on the plane.
As much as I talk about Bespin Luke Skywalker being my favorite action figure growing up, that's only because I never had the Indiana Jones figure from Kenner's Adventures of Indiana Jones line when I was a kid. Eventually, I discovered my cousin had a rather beaten up one, and I traded a batting glove for it. Even without the accessories and a broken thumb, I could see what a cool figure this had been when it was new. A working holster for his revolver and a functional belt hook for his whip, the Kenner Indiana Jones was arguably the best action figure of the early 1980s. He had the common problems of many 3 3/4 inch figures of that period, easily broken thumbs and a spring-loaded action arm that limited his versatility while increasing the chances of breaking said thumb. And like many movie-based toys from back then, the figure simplified some of the details, most notably Indy's satchel, as Kenner had, whether by chance or choice, modeled the figure after Indy's initial encounter with Marion and the Ravenwood bar fight in Nepal, the one time in which the satchel is not worn. Even then, the Kenner Indiana Jones figure was one of the best action figures ever made in the 80s. So when Hasbro told everyone in 2008 that with the release of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, they would also put out waves of figures from the original 3 Indiana Jones films, you can bet I was watching for their Raiders of the Lost Ark offerings like a hawk. You see, in the years between 1989's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and The Return with Crystal Skull, I'd been a staff writer for TheRaider.net, a staff member for IndieGear.com, a writer for long-defunct sites like IndieWeb, and I'd put together my own Raiders of the Lost Ark accurate outfit. Indiana Jones toys coming back was a huge deal for me, and when the first Raiders of the Lost Ark figures hit, I was waiting for the shelves to be stocked. Overall, the Raiders line was really promising, except for the 2 Raiders-specific Indiana Jones figures themselves. Cairo Indy was a figure without knee joints and a limiting leg squeeze action gimmick, while the main Indy had a horrendous face sculpt and very awkward leg articulation. Both had massive gun holsters intended to be functional, but ultimately just goofy looking. The 2 Crystal Skull Indy figures weren't workable substitutes in the long run, and their face sculpts were also lacking. Countless subtle variations of Indiana Jones were packed in with various sets, and even new versions were released during Hasbro's brief flirtation with the Indiana Jones franchise. New from Hasbro, it's the latest action figures in the world of Indiana Jones. Watch out, Indy, it's the evil Colonel Vogel, and the newest henchman, Goose-Stepping Bob. Indiana Jones is back in an exciting new action figure, this time with dust on his pants. Mein Gott! We will never defeat Dr. Jones with those dusty pants. The Third Reich is ruined. It's Indiana Jones with dusty pants, Colonel Vogel, and Goose-Stepping Bob. Other figures and vehicles sold separately. New from Hasbro. By the end of the figure series, it was clear Hasbro had given it the old Barnett College try. But with the signature character itself, they'd bungled it over and over, and really only stuck the landing with their final Indy from Temple of Doom. And he ended up only available at grocery and drug stores because the main retailers stopped ordering the line. I packed away the figures I'd bought and didn't look at them for nearly 13 years. But in preparation for an upcoming video about the Hasbro years of Indiana Jones, I pulled the figures out again. I spent several days inspecting them closely while filling the gaps in my collection through online purchases. As part of that effort, I secured the 2011 Hasbro Lost Wave Indiana Jones, a San Diego Comic-Con exclusive and part of the last sputter from Hasbro's Indiana Jones effort. It was then I noticed he shared the same head as the Temple of Doom Indiana Jones. And then I noticed that the Temple of Doom head was actually a Raiders of the Lost Ark head, because the hat in Raiders is very unique, and this head sculpt recreates that specific hat. The San Diego Comic-Con redo was clearly Hasbro's attempt to redeem the miss on that figure from the 2008 line, but for me it wasn't as definitive as it could have been. In both the 2008 version and the 2011 version, Hasbro was fixated on the idol grab scene from the opening of Raiders. And while that's a great scene, it's not representative of the film's grand adventure to find the Ark of the Covenant. You see, throughout the final half of Raiders of the Lost Ark, from his descent into the Well of Souls, his fight with the Nazis around the Flying Wing, and the climactic convoy chase, Indy is wearing a distinct pair of battered gloves. To me, that will always be the definitive Indiana Jones look. Because if I have to rappel into pits, wave torches at cobras, lift ancient artifacts, push huge stones, punch massive Nazis, ride a horse, leap onto a moving truck, fight more Nazis, get thrown through a windshield, slide under same moving truck, and climb back up into the truck for more fighting, you'd better believe I want my hands protected by some rugged gloves. Remember those many subtle variations of Indy I mentioned in the 2008 Hasbro line? One variation, the version packed with the Arabian horse, is wearing the gloves, and the hands are the very same design as the San Diego Comic-Con Indy. The Arabian horse Indy is the only Raiders Indy figure Hasbro ever made with the gloves. That made me very curious, so I started looking at the rest of the Indy figures across the entire range. One of the other quirks of the Hasbro line was the shoulder bag. Every Indy figure comes with one, but most often the bag is a uniform green color, including the shoulder strap. And the San Diego Comic-Con Indy was no different. In the films, it was a leather strap attached to the canvas bag, so the strap was always some shade of brown. Now, I don't like adding paint to toys if I don't have to. It never has the durability of factory-applied paint. So I wasn't about to start painting shoulder straps. And I didn't have to. The Map Room Indy figure from Hasbro inexplicably came with a shoulder bag with a distinctly correct brown strap. He was the only Indy figure in the entire Hasbro range that had this version of the bag. Weirder still, the Map Room Indy figure proved to be a treasure trove of Raiders accurate accessories in another area. Under his cloth robe was the base body for a Cairo Indy in his signature field shirt with the rolled up sleeves, which I had used years ago for my own custom Cairo Indy to replace the goofy whip gimmick figure. And they'd also given him a gun belt with whip hook hidden away under the robe. Now, most of the Indy figures in the range come with a gun belt with a larger holster that distinctly shows a Webley revolver inside the leather. This is verifiable by the round hinge under the barrel in front of the cylinder that allows the legendary revolver to open for reloading in its signature way. Unfortunately, every Indy was also given a revolver accessory that is very much not a Webley, but something that could be a Smith & Wesson, but also looks very much like a Colt to my eye. Either way, the accessory is much closer to Indy's Raiders of the Lost Ark weapon than the Webley he started carrying in Last Crusade that continued into Crystal Skull. Once again, Hasbro baffles us with its decisions, because the San Diego Comic-Con Indy Raiders figure came with that Webley holster. Now, you might say, well, Michael, since he carries a Webley in Crystal Skull, I'm sure they just made that one version of the gun belt accessory to prioritize the new film and gave it to all the Indy figures. That would be the most cost-effective thing to do. Yeah, I would have thought that too. But when you start looking at some of the other Indy figures, such as the one that comes with the Arabian horse, you see a much smaller gun holster on the belt that is closer to the holster for the shorter-barreled Smith & Wesson revolver from Raiders. Then when you look at the holster under the robe of the Map Room Indy, you're staring at a holster that is not only smaller, but has distinct decorative lines that match the curve of the holster flap. This, my friends, is specific to the holster in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Someone at Hasbro specifically made this holster variation during the production of this line, and yet somehow it didn't end up with their final Raiders Indy. It was hidden under a robe and given to Last Crusade Indy, who, incidentally, carried a Webley in that film. So the Indy that really needed a Webley holster didn't get one, despite the Webley holster being all over the place in this line. And the Indy that really needed the Raiders accurate holster didn't get that one because it was given to a Webley carrying Indy and an Indy in a robe that it is unlikely had a gun belt on anyway. Now we come to the whip. I can hear you saying it now. Isn't a whip a whip? No, not where Indiana Jones is concerned. Before we tackle the whip, I just want to reiterate that my nitpicking on these issues isn't in a vacuum. If the accessory variations for Raiders had never been made, and all of the Raiders Indy figures had been given Crystal Skull accessories, there'd be nothing to say. But the fact is, Hasbro did make these variations Raiders specific, and consistently failed to put them with the correct figures. Okay, back to the whip.
Give me the whip!
Throughout the Hasbro figure line, there were a multitude of various action whips in many poses. But what we're concerning ourselves with here are the coiled whips for the belt. Most of the coiled whips in the Hasbro line have a medium brown coil with a dark brown handle. While not strictly accurate to Crystal Skull, it's far more in the ballpark of the Crystal Skull whips than the whips in the other three films, and particularly Raiders of the Lost Ark. Can you guess what the San Diego Comic-Con Indy came with? That's right, a coiled whip with a dark brown handle. In the original Raiders of the Lost Ark, the bullwhips are a uniform tan color. Now again, if Hasbro didn't make the right versions, we wouldn't continue this discussion. However, they did make a uniformly tan-brown coiled whip, and they packaged it with the Temple of Doom Indiana Jones, as well as one of the very first Crystal Skull Indiana Jones figures in the original assortment, who ended up being a relative peg warmer because he was the only Indiana Jones to inexplicably not have his trademark hat. Finally, there's the torch he comes with. Once again, Hasbro is trying to lean into that idol grab sequence from the opening of Raiders. Except, the Satipo figure already came with the proper torch, and Satipo was the only character in the scene to carry a torch. Meanwhile, the San Diego Comic-Con Indy is given a repaint of Short Round's torch.
Son of a bitch.
Now, as a person who's going for a true Raiders of the Lost Ark Indy, I'm all for a torch, but I want that Well of Souls torch. And that isn't a problem, because Sala came with the correct torch, and Sala can be found fairly easily.
Indy! Ow, Jesus!
So hidden within Hasbro's line, like the Ark in a warehouse full of crates, were the correct parts to make a respectably accurate Raiders of the Lost Ark Indiana Jones figure, and without needing a single lick of paint or permanent customization. Needless to say, all of this was about to be corrected.
Trust me.
For this purpose, I did not use a heat gun, but instead the boiling water method, since so many parts needed to be swapped out. And because I was using a rare San Diego Comic-Con Indy, I didn't want to make a mistake and deform any part of the figure with the heat gun. The various figures were dipped into the boiling water, the hands were popped off, the gun belts and satchels were swapped around, a few heads were exchanged, the whips and torches were transposed, and soon, standing before me, was the Indiana Jones figure I'd always wanted. The other parts went to their proper places as well. Last Crusade Indy got his Webley holster, Crystal Skull Indy got a properly colored coiled whip, Map Room Indy no longer had a cumbersome gun belt under his robe. And the final amusement to all of this was the realization that you sadly need the rare San Diego Comic-Con Indy to achieve this result. Because the San Diego Comic-Con Indy's neck has a larger post for the Temple of Doom head than the 2008 Raiders Indy figure, unless you want to try your hand at building up the original figure's neck post. I swapped out the San Diego Comic-Con head with a Temple of Doom Indy head that I felt had superior paint applications, a Map Room Indy satchel and gun belt, the Crystal Skull rocket launcher Indy's whip, the Arabian Horse Indy's hands, and a torch from Sala if you prefer. And yeah, that resulted in one of my Arabian Horse Indies now having ungloved hands, but all that means is now he's a Last Crusade Indy, and I'll just paint the horse black. Making 2008 Indiana Jones figures more accurate is all about observation, research, reading. We cannot afford to take Hasbro at face value. So forget any ideas you've got about accurate toys right out of the boxes, decent face sculpts, or digging up cheap San Diego Comic-Con Indies. We do not follow maps to turnkey modern figures, and X never, ever marks the spot. Hope you enjoyed that, everybody. If you want to see more videos about Indiana Jones, you can watch our original Indiana Jones action figure feature at the link above. Or you can watch my discussion on Indiana Jones with Matt Movies 611 at the link below. And now that I have my ultimate Indiana Jones figure, I've got to get started on that next video.